In the heart of the American desert, where the Grand Canyon stretches with towering cliffs and bottomless chasms, 4 college friends reunited for one final journey before life would carry them in different directions. Sarah brought her camera to capture every moment. David carefully planned every detail. Lena restlessly sought the more dangerous trails, and Mark carried his ever-present notebook, quietly observing. None of them could have known that what was meant to be a nostalgic trip back to their youth would turn into a nightmare that would haunt them for years. 3 of them vanished without a trace. Only Mark, 7 years later, emerged from the shadows, gaunt and haunted, carrying a story that shocked everyone. What had he really endured in the canyon's depths? And what became of the other 3? The truth he finally revealed would uncover a chilling mystery no one could have imagined. Sarah was the spark of the group, the kind of person whose laughter carried like music and made even the heaviest silence lighter. She had always been the one to pull people together, to remind them of who they once were when life had pulled them apart. With her beloved camera hanging around her neck, she looked at this trip as more than just an adventure. It was a chance to capture a memory, a snapshot of friendship that had survived the storms of adulthood. She wasn't chasing thrills as much as she was chasing something intangible, proof that even after the years, their bond was still alive. David was the planner, the steady hand that held the group in balance. In college, he was known for being meticulous, a man who never set out without a clear goal and a backup plan in case the first one fell apart. It was David who had mapped out the trail, checked the weather reports, and made sure everyone had the gear they needed. Friends often teased him for being overly cautious, but his care had saved them from trouble more than once. To him, the Grand Canyon was not just a natural wonder, but also a test, a place where preparation and resilience would matter as much as courage. Lena, by contrast, lived for unpredictability. She thrived on risk, on choosing the harder path, simply because it was harder. Where David looked for safe routes, Lena veered toward the trails less traveled, drawn to the cliffs and ridges that tested her endurance. Friends described her as restless, always searching for the next edge to push against. She carried that same energy into the canyon, daring the others to follow her into places where the ground felt uncertain, where the silence pressed too close. Her spirit was bold, but boldness has a way of attracting danger. Mark was different still. Quiet, thoughtful, he rarely spoke unless he had something meaningful to say. Instead, he wrote. His notebook was his companion, filled with sketches of landscapes, half-finished poems, and fragments of thoughts that he could never quite say aloud. Where Lena craved danger, Mark sought meaning. He was fascinated by the canyon, not only for its grandeur, but for what it represented, the enormity of time, carved into stone. The reminder that human lives are brief scratches against the surface of eternity. To him, the journey was almost spiritual, a way of confronting silence and finding out what it might reveal. Their reunion had been planned for months, sparked by Sarah's idea that they should see the canyon before another year slipped away. Emails turned into phone calls, and before long, tickets were booked. They met in Arizona in early September, greeted each other with the warmth of old friends, and set out with backpacks heavy but hearts light. At the trailhead, they stopped to take a picture together, Sarah insisting on framing it perfectly, David double-checking their supplies, Lena rolling her eyes impatiently, and Mark scribbling something in his notebook. None of them could have imagined that this photo would become the last evidence of them together, the final trace before the desert swallowed them whole. The first 2 days of their journey were filled with the kind of beauty that leaves you breathless. The Grand Canyon stretched endlessly before them, its walls glowing red and gold beneath the shifting sunday. They laughed as they hiked, shared stories from their college years, and marveled at how little and yet how much they had all changed. At night, under a sky blanketed with stars, Sarah captured long exposure shots, while Lena dared the others to edge closer to the cliffside. Mark wrote in his notebook by the light of his headlamp, while David double-checked the maps for the path ahead. But by the 3rd day, something shifted. The weather forecast had promised clear skies, yet dark clouds began to gather in the distance. The wind picked up, whistling through the canyon walls like a warning. David grew uneasy, suggesting they cut the hike short and head back toward safer ground. Lena laughed it off, urging them to continue deeper into a narrow side canyon she insisted would lead to a breathtaking viewpoint. Against his better judgment, David relented, and the group followed. It was there, within those high stone walls, that the first sign of trouble appeared. The trail narrowed dangerously, with loose rocks sliding under their boots. Sarah slipped once, catching herself just in time, and her nervous laugh barely hid the fear in her eyes. Mark wrote something quickly in his notebook, but when Sarah asked what it was, he simply shook his head. By late afternoon, the storm broke. Thunder rolled overhead, and rain poured down in sheets, transforming the canyon floor into a rushing stream. Flash floods are one of the canyon's deadliest dangers, and David knew it. He shouted for the group to climb higher, scrambling up a slope slick with mud. They found a ledge to cling to as the water raged below, their voices drowned out by the roar. Hours passed before the storm finally eased, and when it did, exhaustion weighed heavy on all of them. They pressed on the next morning, but the canyon seemed different, darker, more oppressive. Food supplies were dwindling faster than expected, and their GPS device began to malfunction, refusing to lock onto a signal. Sarah tried to lighten the mood by snapping photos, but the forced smiles on their faces told another story. Lena pushed them forward with reckless energy, while David's frustration grew and Mark retreated further into silence. That evening they were supposed to check in at a ranger station. They never arrived. Rangers grew concerned when no record of the group appeared, and by the following day, a search and rescue mission was launched. Helicopters scanned the ridges, volunteers combed the trails, and search dogs were brought in to track any scent. They found the campsite from the second night abandoned, with gear scattered as if packed in a rush. Sarah's camera lay in the dirt, lens cracked, film ruined by rain. But of the 4 travelers, there was no trace. No footprints leading away. No belongings left behind beyond that camera. No signal from a phone. It was as if the canyon itself had swallowed them whole. Days stretched into weeks. The search expanded, covering miles of treacherous terrain, yet nothing surfaced. Family members held vigils, clinging to hope, while authorities grew resigned to the possibility of tragedy. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead. But for those who loved them, the lack of answers was worse than death. It was a silence that gnawed at the soul. And so the Grand Canyon kept its secret, leaving behind only questions that no one could answer. 7 years is a long time to live with questions that never find answers. After the Rangers declared the search closed, the families of Sarah, David, Lena, and Mark were left with nothing but photographs, memories, and the unbearable ache of uncertainty. Some held on to hope, clinging to the belief that their loved ones had somehow survived, perhaps injured or lost, but still alive. Others forced themselves to accept the official line missing, presumed dead, though it never truly settled in their hearts. In the small towns where they had grown up, their faces lingered on flyers taped to grocery store windows and pinned to community boards. As the years passed, the ink faded, paper curling at the edges, but the silence remained the same. Reporters came at first, eager to tell the story of 4 young lives swallowed by one of the world's natural wonders. But when no new evidence surfaced, the headlines slowed, and eventually the case slipped into the shadows of forgotten tragedies. For Sarah's parents, every unopened envelope in the mail felt like it could hold news, good or bad. Her mother left Sarah's room untouched, the camera bag still waiting by the desk, as though one day her daughter might walk through the door and pick it up again. David's younger brother joined the army, driven by a need to fill the void, while his father kept maps of the Grand Canyon folded neatly in a drawer, as if he might someday launch his own search. Lena's friends gathered every September to hike a local trail in her memory, though each year fewer people came. Mark's family, quiet and private, rarely spoke of him at all, as though silence was easier than reopening wounds. Yet whispers never truly stopped. On online forums devoted to mysterious disappearances, the story of the Grand Canyon Four lived on. Theories multiplied. Some believed they had fallen victim to a flash flood or rock slide that left no trace. Others speculated foul play, pointing to the missing notebooks and journals as suspicious. A few, more fantastical, claimed they had stumbled into something hidden within the canyon, an ancient cave, a hidden community, or something not of this world. The canyon itself became part of the myth. Hikers who passed through the same trails sometimes reported strange feelings, a sense of being watched, or echoes that carried too long in the still air. Search and rescue volunteers who had once combed the area admitted, years later, that something about that mission never sat right with them. The abruptness, the lack of physical evidence, the way 4 people could vanish so completely. As the 7th year drew to a close, the families began to resign themselves to the grim reality that answers would never come. The canyon had taken their loved ones, and the silence would remain forever. But then, one autumn morning, a phone rang. A hospital in Arizona reported that a man had been found wandering near a highway, disoriented, gaunt, and dehydrated. When authorities asked his name, he gave it in a whisper, Mark. After 7 years of silence, one had returned. And with him, a truth darker than anyone could have imagined was about to surface. When the news first broke, few believed it. After 7 years of silence, after vigils that had dwindled into quiet remembrance, after authorities had long ago shifted their attention elsewhere, the idea that one of the 4 missing travelers had somehow returned seemed impossible. And yet, there he was, Mark, the quiet observer, the one who had always carried a notebook instead of a camera alive. He was found at dawn by a truck driver along a desolate stretch of highway in northern Arizona. At first glance, the man appeared homeless, little more than a shadow of who he once was. His beard was long and unkempt, his clothes tattered and sun-bleached, and his skin bore the leathery scars of years spent under a relentless Sunday. When paramedics arrived, he resisted at first, flinching at their touch, as though human contact was something foreign. But when they pressed him gently for his name, his cracked lips whispered a word that sent chills through them all. Mark. At the hospital, doctors described him as severely malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from exhaustion. Yet physically, he bore no major injuries. Nothing that could account for 7 missing years. What unsettled the staff most was his demeanor. He often stared at blank walls for hours, as though replaying images no one else could see. Sometimes he would mutter to himself in fragments, sentences cut short, words that sounded like apologies. And when asked about the others, Sarah, David, Lena, his eyes darkened, and silence became his only answer. News of his reappearance spread quickly. Families who had spent years mourning were suddenly confronted with hope tangled with dread. Sarah's mother drove overnight to the hospital, clutching her daughter's old camera in trembling hands, desperate to know what Mark might reveal. David's brother, hardened by years of service, found himself fighting back tears in the hospital lobby. Even Lena's friends gathered again, their questions flooding back all at once. How had Mark survived? Why had he stayed away? And above all, what had happened to the other 3? Authorities wasted no time in surrounding the hospital. Detectives reopened the long cold case, determined to pull answers from Mark's fragile mind. They showed him photographs of the group, the smiling faces taken at the trailhead so many years ago. He stared at them for long minutes, his fingers hovering over each face as though afraid to touch them. Finally, in a voice low and hoarse, he whispered, "Gone. They're all gone." Still, questions piled up. Where had he been living all this time? Why had no one seen him before now? His story, when he began to tell it, came in fragments, snatches of memory blurred with fear. He spoke of the storm, of the floodwaters that tore through their camp. He spoke of desperate climbs, of losing track of time, of voices calling in the night that might not have been real. Nurses reported that sometimes, in his sleep, he cried out the names of his friends, followed by pleas for forgiveness. Yet even as he began to speak, his words deepened the mystery rather than solved it. He claimed he had survived by finding shelter in caves carved into the canyon walls, surviving on rainwater and what little food nature offered. But if that were true, Why had no rescue teams found him during the exhaustive searches? Why had he not emerged sooner? For the families, his return was both a miracle and a curse. They longed for closure, for answers to the torment that had stretched across 7 long years. But every glance at Mark, every haunted silence, suggested that the truth he carried was something no one was prepared to hear. And soon, that truth, when it finally came, would shake them to their core. At first, the words came haltingly, slipping from Mark's mouth like fragments of a dream too heavy to hold. Doctors and detectives gathered in the quiet hospital room, along with the families who had waited years for answers. The air was thick with anticipation, every heartbeat echoing louder than the tick of the clock. And then, at last, Mark began. He spoke of the storm, the thunder that rattled the canyon walls, the rain that turned paths into rivers, the flood that nearly swept them all away. The water, it came so fast, and we couldn't see each other. We were screaming, trying to climb. I thought I was going to die. His hands trembled, and he gripped the bedsheets, as though still clinging to a ledge. According to Mark, they managed to survive the flood by scaling a rocky slope, clinging there until dawn broke. But the victory was short-lived. Their supplies had been washed away, food ruined, maps soaked beyond use. GPS devices wouldn't work, and every attempt to regain their trail led only to deeper confusion. The Grand Canyon had become a labyrinth, endless and merciless. "We thought we could find our way back," Mark said, "but every turn looked the same. Days blurred. Hunger started to eat at us, and we fought not just with the canyon, but with each other." His voice cracked at that, and for the first time, Sarah's mother wept openly. Her hands pressed against her face. Mark claimed that Lena grew restless, insisting they should push forward toward higher ground, believing she could lead them out. David disagreed, urging the group to retrace their steps and find familiar landmarks. Their arguments grew heated, and in the chaos, Sarah tried to calm them, though even she was breaking under exhaustion. The first tragedy came suddenly. Lena, frustrated and determined, climbed a narrow ridge despite David's warnings. The rocks gave way. Mark said he could still hear the sound of stone collapsing. The scream cut short as her body disappeared into the abyss. They shouted her name until their voices broke, but there was no answer, no sign. Just silence. From there, everything unraveled. With only 3 left, despair gnawed at them. David became increasingly frantic, pushing them to move faster, to keep searching for an exit. Sarah grew weaker, unable to keep pace without food. Mark remembered her eyes tired, but still carrying hope that someone would find them. Then came the night Sarah vanished. They had taken shelter in a shallow cave, their bodies huddled together for warmth. Mark awoke to find her gone. No sound, no struggle, no note, just gone. "I searched," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I searched until my feet bled, but she was never there. It was like the canyon took her while we slept." David's end was no less mysterious. Mark described how, days later, weakened and delirious, David wandered off while fetching water. Mark followed the sound of his footsteps echoing against the canyon walls, but they faded into silence. When he reached the stream, David was gone, as if the desert had swallowed him whole. And then there was only Mark. Alone, starving, haunted by the loss of each friend, he stumbled from one cave to another, scribbling in his notebook to keep himself sane, until one night, during a rockfall, the notebook slipped from his pack and was lost to the canyon's depths. But the strangest part of his account was not the deaths, but what came after. He insisted he heard their voices at night, Sarah calling his name, Lena laughing from the cliffs, David's urgent commands echoing in the dark. "I don't know if they were ghosts," he said, his eyes hollow, "or if it was my mind breaking, but I swear they were there with me, watching, waiting." When detectives pressed him on why he hadn't returned sooner, why it took 7 years, Mark's answer was chilling. He whispered, "The canyon wouldn't let me. Every time I tried to climb out, something stopped me. Storms, rockfalls, even shadows. I don't know if they were real, but I wasn't free. Not until now." The room fell silent. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned forward, desperate to know more. But one truth was undeniable. 3 friends had vanished forever, and the only witness left alive carried scars deeper than any wound. And though Mark's story brought answers, it left behind a darker question: had he told them everything? Or was there a truth even more terrible, one he could never bring himself to speak? When Mark finished, the room was heavy with silence. Families clutched one another, torn between grief, anger, and disbelief. The answers they had begged for all these years had finally come, but instead of relief, there was only deeper sorrow. Sarah, Lena, and David would not be coming home. Their lives had ended somewhere in the endless maze of the Grand Canyon, their final moments shrouded in fear and despair. But even as Mark's words painted the picture of tragedy, doubts lingered. Detectives whispered about inconsistencies in his story. Why had no trace of bodies, clothing, or belongings been found, even after years of searching? Why had Mark's notebook, which he claimed to carry everywhere, been lost in the canyon with no trace ever recovered? And why did his recollections sound more like fragments of a nightmare than clear memories? The families asked themselves the same haunting questions. Could he have left something out? Was there guilt he could not confess? Or was he truly a man broken by 7 years in the wilderness, his mind fractured by starvation and solitude? No one could say for sure. And in the end, perhaps that uncertainty was the cruelest truth of all. Mark was released from the hospital weeks later, but he lived like a ghost. He avoided cameras, declined interviews, and disappeared quietly into obscurity. Some believed he wanted to escape the weight of suspicion. Others thought he simply wanted to forget. Yet no one could forget him, because he was the last living thread to a mystery that refused to die. For the families, life became a balance between remembrance and acceptance. Memorials were held, candles lit, names etched into stone. Each September, a few still journeyed back to the canyon, leaving flowers at the trailhead where 4 friends had once begun their hike. They stood at the rim, staring into the vastness, wondering if somewhere below lay the truth that had never surfaced. The Grand Canyon, for all its breathtaking beauty, had proven itself merciless. It gave no answers, only silence. And for those who knew the story, the canyon was never again just a tourist destination. It became a place of shadows, where laughter had turned to echoes, and where 4 young travelers had stepped into history only to vanish. Perhaps the lesson hidden in their tragedy is not about the canyon itself, but about life's fragile edge, how quickly joy can dissolve into despair, how thin the line between memory and loss truly island. Their story reminds us that adventure carries risks, and that nature, as awe-inspiring as it may be, does not forgive mistakes. To those who hear this tale, let it be both a warning and a tribute. A warning to respect the wilderness, to never underestimate its power. And a tribute to Sarah, Lena, David, and even Mark, the 4 who ventured into the canyon together, but only one who returned to tell the tale. And yet, as the sun sets over the cliffs and shadows lengthen in the depths, the question still lingers. Did we truly hear the whole truth? Or has the canyon kept a secret so dark, it will never let it go? If stories like this make your heart race and leave you thinking long after the video ends, don't forget to subscribe to Last Seen. Here, we uncover the world's most haunting disappearances and chilling returns. Hit the bell so you never miss a mystery waiting to be told.